Today we have Graeme Snow for this lecture on polar bear in time of climate change. Graeme is a seasoned polar expeditioner, seasoned polar guide, and I've been on a couple of trips with him and pretty fascinated with his lectures on polar bears. So we are very fortunate to have him with us on the Big Days trip as well. And I'm sure you'll find out more about him during the trip. So now, Graeme, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm currently on one of the Aurora ships. I'm on the Greg Mortimer, heading to Longyearbyen already. But yeah, we've got a bit of an opportunity to spend a bit of time, and I can go over a bit of information about polar bears, a bit about their biology and their breeding and their life cycle, because that's important to understand, because that's what makes them vulnerable to climate changes. And as I said, we'll go through some of that so that you have a better understanding about why these issues really affect them. So a little bit about their sort of biology and life, a bit about where we find them and how many there are, and then a bit about some of the challenges that they're facing in various ways, which are affecting their numbers quite significantly. So hopefully if we get through this, you'll be a bit sort of forewarned or forearmed with information before we start our trip in a couple of weeks' time. But to start off with, polar bears. So polar bears, they might appear to be terrestrial animals, and in some ways they are, but generally they're considered marine mammals because they are really, really tied to the marine environment, whether that be water or ice. But they're very much adapted to life in a maritime environment. They're closely related to brown bears, and they can actually hybridize with brown bears. They're evolved from a Siberian population of brown bears dating back about 500,000 years. So they've diverted off from that brown bear population and have then been isolated in this Arctic environment and really evolved to be absolute specialists in this cold and wet environment. They're the largest of all the bear species. So if you've seen bears in other areas and you haven't seen a polar bear before, you might be surprised or hopefully impressed by how big they are. And they're the largest land carnivore and the top predator in the Arctic. They're a species which rules over their entire area, and that's why we have to be so careful with our activities up here as well. Some of you may have been in various areas or maybe in the Antarctic, and we can roam around fairly freely, but things change completely in the Arctic and our operations and the way that we do things, because they are the top predator. And so we have to take steps accordingly. They're specially adapted to the cold and particularly the marine environment, as I said, and that's where they've diverted off from brown bears. They have a white or yellowish or light grey hair, and you might be surprised that when we see them, they have quite a yellowish tinge or a tan sort of colour. And it's not because their hair is white, it's because it's hollow. They're hollow tubes, and you can see there the picture of the cross-section of a hair. It's a microscopic image of it, and it's a hollow, clear tube. And so the outer part is light, or it can have various tinges to it, but their skin is black. So this light skin allows them to both blend in the white Arctic environment, but also stay very warm because they have these hollow tubes, so it's a form of insulation as well. They have a very small head compared to other bears. They have a longer neck, and they don't have a big shoulder hump. So again, for a marine environment and to also reduce their heat loss. They have smaller ears, again, for reducing heat loss, particularly in cold, windy conditions. They have partially webbed front paws. They use them for when they're swimming. And they're very agile and very adept swimmers, very capable. And so, again, they have these adaptations that allows them to flourish in that environment. And they're able to store large amounts of fat. And that I'll go into a bit later, how that affects their survival, but also how changes in the environment particularly felt by polar bears because of the way that they live throughout a year. They have long periods of feast and then long periods of famine in their normal day-to-day life. And because they can store these large amounts of fat, that normally allows them to survive through these ups and downs through the year. But as things change, that makes their survival that much more difficult, or it works against them in some regards. So we'll go into that as well. But then they have very large amounts of fat, not only for insulation, but to allow them to survive in these long periods. Yeah, so the bears are big, as I said, but there is quite a bit of sexual dimorphism. So there's a difference between the sexes. So the males are significantly bigger, not so much in height or stature, although they are quite a bit bigger in some regards, but certainly in their volume, their bulk. And the males 2 to 3 times the weight of the females. So they can be quite noticeable in their difference if we see them. They live around about the same length of time, 25 to 35 years, somewhere in there. The males, sometimes a bit shorter because they have a much more, aggressive lifestyle, and they're often competing for females and fighting, and that takes a lot of energy, and they suffer injuries, so they have a shorter life generally. And the worldwide population is somewhere between 22 to 31,000. That's kind of a 95% confidence band there. There are areas where there's very little information known, and there are areas, particularly right around the North Pole, where there is not enough continuous ice, or they're not near land, and so it's difficult to count them with any confidence, and so there's very little information known. But it's generally thought that it's in the sort of mid-20,000s in terms of numbers of the bears. Where we're going on the voyage, in the Svalbard or the Barents Sea region, there's somewhere around 2,700 to 3,000 individual bears, which is pretty significant because it represents around about 10% of the world population. And I'll go into a bit more later about the various regions and how they're sort of considered. And so it's one of the highest concentrations or the largest population groups in the Arctic region. So going to Svalbard is one of the prime spots to go to see polar bears completely in their natural environment, although a lot of that, as I said, is the Barents Sea region. We'll explain that a bit more later too. They're very solitary animals. They very often will be on their own, and when we see bears, they're generally on their own, not in groups. They don't congregate in family groups like some other predators. They don't work cooperatively as such. The only time that you see them together is generally mothers and cubs, or if there is a carcass around and they all happen to be in the same place at the same time. The females mature a little bit earlier than the males. So again, the males have a shorter life, but it takes them longer to become mature. And the females will start their breeding at around about 5 years of age. So they mate in April and May or thereabouts. And again, it's a significant time of year because it's as the winter is diminishing, the spring is coming, and as I'll mention a bit later, with the change in conditions, that period of time is feeling pressure in terms of the availability of ice. And because they roam solitary in areas to find each other to mate, they have to essentially accidentally cross paths. The males can sense females. They have extremely good sense of smell, and they will be able to detect on the ice the chemicals that the females produce through the pads on their paws. And so they can find the scent of a female that may have passed in an area many days before, and then they will follow that trail. So they're mating in April, May. Traditionally, it's been quite, regular for them to find each other on the ice, but as ice disappears, that's becoming more of a challenge. So they do mate in April, May, but the males will mate with anybody that they cross with. They will just try and they'll stay with the female. They'll, as I said, pursue them for some time. They will mate with them over the course of a couple of days, and then they'll move on and hopefully find another female. Males will compete. So if the males all converge on a single female. They'll compete and there'll be one winner. And basically he will chase off all the other males. But then they will try to mate with more than one female in any particular season. Despite the fact that they mate early in the summer or in the spring, the gestation is actually fairly short. So they have this delayed implantation where the embryo doesn't actually develop or form in the uterus until later in the year, around September, October. So at the end of the summer. So again, because of the time that this all happens, their condition and how much food and how much fat they've been able to put on in that summer period is very important. And again, that has a big impact as conditions change. So the implantation occurs in the females later, after they've mated some months earlier. And then the pregnant females need to go to a place where there is deep snow and they build a den. They dig a hole, they basically cover it over, and they will rest in there until they give birth. So they're conserving as much energy. They're staying out of the depths of the cold in the winter, and they're finding places where they can then stay very unaffected, uninterrupted, and wait for the birth to take place. So again, it's important to note this cycle and the changes that are happening as conditions change. So they go into their den, and then in around about New Year, they can have anywhere between 1 and 3 cubs. Kind of 1 to 2 is most typical, but 3 is possible. Again, it depends on their condition, and it depends on how much food, not only that they have found before the birth, but then subsequent, as to how many they can support. They have to be able to suckle them for some months, and then obviously exit the den and then look after them, finding new food. So the babies are tiny. Again, they need to have these dens because they need to protect the young. They're only about 0.5 kilo, and they're completely blind and have very little fur at birth. So the dens are very important. Did we lose the feed there, Michael?
Yeah, back on now. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Do I need to share again, I think?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, how are we now? All good?
We're not still seeing your screen, though. We're not seeing your screen.
According to me, it says it's sharing.
It's sharing. Okay, now it's seeing now. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So as I was saying, they suckle the young in the den or very close to the den for a few months, 3 to 4 months. And then as the worst of the weather in the winter dissipates, they'll be up to a reasonable size, and they will exit the den and go further afield as the spring begins. So they'll stay together. As I said, the only time we really see groups of bears is generally mothers and cubs, because they will stay together for up to 2 years. Initially, they'll stay quite close together, but as the young ones get older and they get a bit more confident and they learn their way in the world a little better and they develop their hunting skills and their stalking skills, they will go further afield from their mother, but they'll be fairly closely sort of associated for a couple of years, and then eventually the mother will abandon the young ones, and they'll go their own way. And then she's ready to mate again. Because they start out relatively small, because they're going into the wider world as the summer comes on, which is not the best time in terms of food for them, it's actually quite tough. The survival rates, even in the best of times, can be as low as 30%. So 70% of the cubs which are born in those dens won't make it through to 2 years to go their own separate way. So I'll explain a bit more about that later, how that's being impacted as well with changes. So at that point, the mother abandons the young ones, and then she will go about her way again and will be ready to mate. Once the mother doesn't have the cubs, she will go into estrus and she will be able to mate. And so males know that females with cubs aren't ready to mate. And so that is a big threat to the young ones, are the males. Males are almost certainly not related to any cubs that they encounter because they don't stay with the female, they don't form a family bond. And so they're quite willing to kill young cubs to then induce or force the female to become receptive again for mating. And so again, that contributes to the high mortality rate of the cubs, particularly in their first year. As they get a bit older, they have a little bit more of a chance of survival, but it's not great. The males, meanwhile, after they mate, they continue to roam and forage. They go, as I said, very solitary. They roam large areas. And because sometimes food is quite scarce, unlike other bears, they don't hibernate, but they will construct sometimes a day den or a small area where they can lie and rest. If food becomes scarce, they need to conserve their energy, conserve their fat reserves, and they'll, for short periods of maybe a few days or a week or so, will construct this little area where they can rest, maybe get covered with a bit of blowing snow, stuff like that, which will give them a bit of insulation, and they can sort of extend their ability to survive in periods of low food availability. So they don't hibernate at all. Even the females, when they're in the dens, they're not hibernating. They're just in a very restive state. So it allows them to conserve their energy. They can lower their metabolic rate and they can lower their body temperature to try and conserve that fat reserves that they have. And then after a while, they will go out and again start hunting and roaming to look for food. So they may starve for many months. And during that starvation period, as I said, they're relying on their fat reserves. And again, some of the implications of this will become a bit more apparent later on. They can depend on those fat reserves for periods long enough that they can lose half their body weight. So it's very important that if they're coming into a period of relatively low food availability, which is the later part of the spring and the early summer, and particularly through the summer, that they do have good fat reserves. So the winter and the spring is a very important period for them to reach that condition where they're going to survive the lean periods. Losing half your body weight in a very cold environment, that fat, although I said they have that fur to insulate them, that fat, if that disappears, that makes them again very vulnerable to heat loss and losing their ability to survive in the cold marine environment. So they're very mobile, as I said, and they don't have territories. They don't defend territories, but they do tend to roam within what's kind of known as a home range. They will cross paths with other bears, but as I said, big males will chase off others. So they're kind of protective of an area, or they have a familiar area that they'll roam around, and it can be up to around about 500 square kilometres, but they don't have a territory which they defend or mark or do things like that. They will mark areas so that other bears know that they're around, or as I said, they can detect the chemicals in their paws that they leave on the snow with their very good sense of smell, but they don't defend a territory, or they don't have a base that they come back to over and over. They'll just roam over the sea ice generally. They're very, very quick. And this is why we have to be very careful when we're out doing our excursions on land. They can at maximum run 40 to 50 kilometres an hour. And so they can cover a distance of around about 50 metres or so in under 5 seconds at full speed. They generally don't run at full speed for very long, but they certainly can get up to very high speeds. Even when they're walking, they look very lazy and they lope along, but they're a very big animal. They have a very long stride and they can cover long distances very quickly. And so they can be quite deceptive. They can cover very long distances in very short spaces of time. They can also swim very quickly. As I said, they have those webbed front paws. They can swim at around about 10 kilometres an hour and, again, cover quite big distances. So they can get from one island across to another island in a matter of minutes, even if it's a kilometre or two apart, and continue their roaming, or get from ice floe to ice floe very quickly. They swim long distances as well. People are kind of surprised. If we're out in the ship in the middle of the ocean, they say, "Oh, can we see a bear here?" And the answer is yes. They can swim regularly 250 kilometres. And some records have been with satellite tracking of over 650 kilometres in a single swim. And that swim could be up to 10 to 12 days without ever getting up onto the land or onto the snow and ice. So that's where it's really apparent that they're a marine animal. They can swim long distances. The downside of that is it's very high energy activity. It consumes about 5 times as much energy as walking. So when they're walking on the sea ice, they're conserving a lot more energy than when they have to swim between the ice. So in the winter, when there's a lot of ice cover, it's really the prime season for them. They have a lot of food availability. They have good access to a large area, and they can do it efficiently. When that ice starts to break up and they have to go in and out of the water more, or if they have to swim greater distances because there's less ice, that's when they start to consume a lot more energy. And so they can do it, but there's a price for that, and there's a trade-off. So they have a very strong link to the sea ice. We see them in the summer on land. We do occasionally see them in water, but for all of those reasons, because of the availability of food, because of the conservation that they have in terms of energy, and because of their ability to locate particularly members of the opposite sex, they have a very strong link to the sea ice. And so the sea ice and the presence of sea ice and the continued presence of sea ice is what really determines the presence of polar bears into the future and into the longer term. And I've got a little video here. This is Hudson Bay in northern Canada, and you can see the coloured dots are tracks of individual bears. And so you can see the date down in the bottom there. This is in the early part or the late part of the summer and coming into the winter. And you can see they were on the land, and as soon as the ice starts to form, they go onto the ice. That's where their home is. That's where they can make their way and survive best. So they're out there looking for seals. They're looking for food, which they can't get on the land. So they huddle onto the land in the lean periods when there's no ice around. But the very moment that ice starts to form near the shore, they'll be onto the shore. And then when it covers the whole bay, you can see those territories I was talking about where they're roaming around pretty much constantly looking for food, occasionally crossing paths. But now, again, as we're getting into the spring and the ice is starting to retreat, they're no longer out on that ice. They spend very little time in the water and they retreat to the land. So it's really their last sort of hope is to be on the land, on the snow, obviously snow or ice-covered territory there. But you can see there how much or how important the sea ice is to them and for the long, long months. So the longer you have that ice, the better chance they have. And so that's where the problem starts to occur with things that are happening now. As the ice or the presence of that ice reduces in time, it's reducing their ability to thrive, and it's reducing their prime season to meet their peak condition, which allows them to mate and breed successfully. So it's all sort of interrelated and tied together. So the reason they're out on the ice, as I said, is they're looking for food. They largely feed on ringed and harp and bearded seals, and particularly ring seals. Ring seals form dens under that sea ice. The bears can detect the seals at many kilometres away, even when the seals are in the water under the ice. The ring seals dig little dens from the water side, from the underside, up into that frozen sea surface, and they form these little caves. And so from the surface, you can't see or hear anything, but the bears can detect it through the ice. The ring seals have their pups in these little caves, essentially. And so the bears are roaming around, listening, smelling, trying to find them, and then detecting them through the ice where they can ambush them, essentially. They'll also wait for them at the breeding holes, the harp and the bearded seals in particular. As the sea ice is frozen over, the seals still need to come to the surface, either through a small hole or a crack. And so bears will sit very patiently waiting for an unsuspecting seal to pop its head up, and they'll be just there ready to grab it. And so that's why they're on the ice. The seals are the best food source for them because they are a high source of fat. They have large fat content. They have muscle and other organs as well, but it's really the fat content that they're looking for. And so that's when they make their prime recovering their condition if they do have to fast or if they have periods of low food availability. So they use their weight, they break through with their front paws, they rear up onto their rear legs, break through with the front paws into these dens and grab the ring seals out. And so, again, if you don't have sea ice, you don't have the home for these seals, you don't have the seals in those numbers, and you reduce the food availability for the bears. So again, it's all interrelated. It's very time consuming. As I said, they have to wait for some days sometimes to ambush seals at breathing holes. And even when they do make an attempt either to break through or to grab one as it appears at a breathing hole, there's a very low success rate. Only about 1 in 20 hunts are successful. So they have to spend a lot of time and be very patient getting this food that they need as in the period where it's most available to them. And on average, over the course of a year, they need to consume about 1 seal per week, so around about 50 a year, whether it's a big male or whether it's a female. Female obviously has to get a lot of fat condition because then she has to produce milk to suckle the young. And so they need to consume around about, on average, 1 good-sized seal per week, give or take. But they only get about two-thirds of their entire year's energy in the late spring and early summer, that period when the sea ice is plentiful, when the seals are there, and when the ice is maybe just breaking up in the late spring, and so those breathing holes are more numerous, and the ice is slightly thinner so they can break through into those dens more easily. So they have to pack a lot in to that period of time when the ice is in its prime condition for them. It might not be at its strongest or its thickest, but it's the prime time for them to be able to get the food. So they have to pack a lot in to a short period of time through their year. They can fast, as I said, but generally, once they get to a point after about 100 to 180 days, their condition starts to deteriorate to a point where they lose that fat, they lose the ability to regulate their temperature in the cold that well, and they become progressively weaker and they can't hunt as effectively or efficiently. So they can fast, but their survival, if they have to fast for anything over about 100 to 180 days, their survival drops off significantly. They may be lucky and they may be able to sort of stretch it along for a bit, but that 100 days is quite critical. And again, that will become sort of apparent as to how that's changing in later slides I'll show you. They'll also prey on walrus, beluga, narwhal. They'll take seabirds and eggs. They're hunting increasingly for reindeer on land, which is quite unusual because reindeer can very easily outrun them in terms of terrain and their group size, and reindeer are fairly small. They don't have the fat content that the walrus and the belugas and things have. Seabirds are very, very small. They'll also be around seabird colonies looking for eggs, because in the breeding season, that's all that's available to them, the bird breeding season, that is. And so basically they'll take anything that's available. Carcasses are very common feeding sites for them. If a whale or a walrus carcass washes up on a beach, they'll often smell that, come around, and if it's a large whale like a fin whale or a blue whale, that will provide food for many, many bears for maybe months and months, even a couple of years. Some carcasses in Svalbard have been in the same place for 2 or 3 seasons, and the bears come back to it over and over. And it's like a supermarket. You see 10 bears all sitting around. They go down and have their pick, and then they go back and sit, and they'll stay with the carcass because it's an easy meal. But if they're not in the prime feeding season, they're basically trying to get by on anything they can find. And so you'll see them scratching around on the ground looking for the smallest seabird eggs, just to try and eke out any sort of extra energy to get them through to the period of time when the feeding becomes better again, so they don't sort of fall into that dangerous 150 to 180 day period. And then, of course, human refuse as well, where there are settlements. We leave food and scraps around. In some communities, they feed dogs and things. They have seals, seal hunts, stuff like that. So there are scraps left around, and bears will find that. When we come to Longyearbyen, you'll see the waste receptacles, the bins there are large, almost armoured sort of receptacles to make sure that they can be locked and closed properly. And so you don't provide sort of waste available for bears, because they don't want to attract bears into the township where there are people going about their day-to-day life. But as things get more and more difficult for the bears, humans and human waste is becoming more attractive to them, and so they can interact more closely. Their only predator is humans. We shoot them, we hunt them. Traditionally, over many, many centuries, the local population have relied on bears not only for food but also for the other products, whether that be bone, teeth, furs, you name it, and that still continues to this day. And as things change, their proximity and their interactions with humans are increasing, because, as I said, as food becomes more scarce, they're being attracted more to possibilities of refuse in human settlements. The areas where we are living are expanding, and so we're encroaching more and more into their traditional sort of territories. And so interactions with humans are increasing, and with that also brings danger for the bears. We go out armed as a final sort of level of protection when we do our activities in the Arctic, but nobody wants to shoot a bear. But as interactions increase, those interactions are becoming more frequent and more dangerous, or there's more of those dangerous style of interactions. And so the potential for bears to come under threat from their own predators, which is us, is increasing as well. So again, as conditions change, it's forcing us together and changing the interactions and changing the danger levels that we pose to each other. As I said, hunting has been a thing in the past and still is to some degree. Tourist hunting was quite popular in Svalbard from the 50s right through until the early 70s. In 1973, there was an agreement on the conservation of polar bears, which was a worldwide agreement. It was around the whole Arctic. And so trophy or tourist hunting stopped back in the 1970s. There was, however, still local hunting, and I'll explain that in a minute. But in addition to just the agreement on the conservation of polar bears in the 70s, there was an actual action plan enforced in September 2015, And the 5 countries which are polar bear sort of native territory, the USA, Canada, Norway, Greenland, and Russia, came together and made an agreement that not only would they could put in place the conditions to conserve polar bears, but they would take active plans to try and promote their conservation. So laws were changed to promote things like proximity, things like us being excluded from areas where there is denning were enacted so that we don't interact with bears when they're small, things like that. So plans were put in place, and also auditing procedures were put in place so that there was regular updating to see how this action plan was going. And there was a kind of a feedback loop between putting in place actions and then seeing how effective they were or whether they needed to change. Unfortunately, now with Russia, things are kind of a bit on the outer, and Russia is a large portion of the Arctic territory. But the other countries are still pursuing that, and hopefully down the track things return to somewhere near normal and we get the full Arctic area back on that action plan again. As I said, hunting was stopped for trophy hunting, but there is still hunting by Indigenous peoples in the whole Arctic area. They use it as a source of food. They use it as sources of clothing. Their traditional clothing often was polar bear skins. They also use seal skins. But increasingly, rather than relying on the skins in what you might term a more traditional sense, they became a source of income. So the skins, the claws, the teeth were sold. And so for Indigenous people, it became a source of income that they could use in other ways. The quotas that they receive are based on individual polar bear populations within the regions of those areas. The numbers across the whole Arctic are something around 500 to 700 bears per year. So it's around about 2 to 3% of the total population of bears. It's been deemed that that is sustainable, but as numbers fluctuate or as particular regions come under pressure due to changes, those numbers need to be looked at and may need to change. So it's not a static number, and it certainly may continue in some areas but not be possible in other areas. So generally, hunting does still happen, but it's fairly small numbers and it's region specific. They're also threatened by environmental pollution and climate change, and this is where we sort of come into the crux of what we, with our trips with Michael, and we've seen previously and we talk about a lot, this is where we're having an impact, and this is where we're trying to explain to people what the real dangers and changes are as we go forward. So environmental pollution, just quickly, is a problem that's been in some areas more than others for some years, and it comes down to these what's known as persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, and things like polychlorinated biphenyls, which are chemicals which are used often in industrial processes or in things like industrial machinery and devices that are used with electricity generation and distribution, some industrial processes, manufacturing, and these were used quite widely, particularly until some years ago, but I guess some people might have heard the term forever chemicals, and these fall into that category of forever chemicals. Once they're in the environment or they're in the system, they continue to circulate, and the problem there is that they move up the food chain and they move up to the top predators first, and they accumulate very well in blood and fatty tissues. And so, as I said, the bears are putting on large amounts of fat and they're trying to suckle the young. And so the bears, being the top of the food chain, they're the ones that are most affected. So it goes into the environment, it goes then into maybe the fish, which the birds eat, which then maybe is passed on in other ways, or the seals will eat the fish, the bears eat the seals, and so these POPs go chain, and they accumulate in these large stores of fat that the bears accumulate. And there's been quite large effects on the bears through this happening. It affects their hormone levels, their ability to regulate their hormone levels, which again affects their growth rates, their metabolism. It can change their immune responses so they are more prone to disease, and it affects their reproductive success. It can change the sperm counts in males. There's been evidence of young being born which are they're hermaphroditic, or they have gender issues so that they're not able to reproduce. And so the accumulation of these POPs has already been having an effect on the bears to some degree over years, even without the change in the environment. As I said, it changes the fertility in the males and creates reproductive abnormalities in the young ones, and on that flows. Because the POPs are in the blubber and that's released during their starvation, those long periods of starvation that they have to endure, and the high content of the high fat content that the mothers produce, it's exacerbated. So the mothers pass it on immediately to the young. So the young start out with getting these high concentrations of these POPs because they're starving when they're denning, and also the males, as I said, if they go into those day dens and they're reducing their hunting. With the reduction in the foraging habitat and the reduced food intake, that's going to mean that they rely on their fat reserves more often rather than replenish it and hunt more year round. And so they're subjected to the effects of these chemicals increasingly. And in the Svalbard region, the bears there have been found with huge levels of POPs, sometimes 20 times higher than populations in the other areas. And the reason for that is the location of Svalbard. So Svalbard and the Barents Sea population extends from where Svalbard is across to the western coast of Russia. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, huge factories and lots of ships and lots of materials were abandoned and just left. There was no money to not only just keep them operating, but not to be able to deal with the waste in any sort of meaningful way. They were just left in ports or on the shores or in townships. Factories were just walked away from. And so there was no attempt or no way to try and stop these POPs from getting into the environment, these PCBs. And so in that region, it's all come across from Russia, the currents flow and they end up in the Svalbard region. And so all of these chemicals have ended up in the area where the bears in Svalbard are feeding. And so they've accumulated quite large amounts of these POPs, much more than in other areas around the Arctic, just as a sort of a circumstance of their location. So that's had a bit of an impact on some of the bears in Svalbard in particular. So that's the POPs, but now we get on to the climate change part, and this is the thing which is changing fairly rapidly, and I guess the focus of a lot of what we're doing in this talk and on the trip. And I guess everybody knows or has heard stories that in the Arctic, the sea ice extent year-round has been reducing fairly significantly. So back in the 70s, you can see here from the chart, there was around about 2.7 million square miles of sea ice in September. So that's the minimum. At the end of summer, the minimum extent of the sea ice. So around about 2.7 million square miles, or about 7 million square kilometres. And that has progressively over the decades reduced to around about 4.4 million square kilometres. The most recent figures are about 2023. And so this, as I said, has a big effect on the bears because this is the time when they are at their most vulnerable. They rely on that sea ice. Even if there is sea ice in the winter, it's that summer period. And the extension of that summer period, or that extension of the relative reduction in the volume or the area of sea ice that affects them. You're creeping into those periods where the sea ice extent isn't just reduced for 80 days, 90 days. You're creeping up into that period where it's regularly 120, 130, 150 days. And so that gets into that region where their survivability starts to drop. So it's not just a matter of the sea ice reducing, but it's the reduction of the sea ice at certain periods of time. The reduction in the sea ice isn't even either. It's different in different regions. So when we talk about bears, there are 19 different population groups that we speak of. And because they're in different locations, they're affected differently, and they have different pressures on them, and they have different techniques, or they have different ways of getting through the year, dependent on the area that they're living in. And so there's 4 main groups that these 19 different regions are divided up into. You can see here up on the extreme sort of left-hand side, the BS, that's the Barents Sea and Svalbard region. So that's the area that we will be in for the voyage. You can see here Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland's over here, Canada and the US, Alaska, and then Russia all around this area. So we're in this Barents Sea region here, which is what's known as a divergent region. But the other regions, so you have in northern Canada what's known as the archipelago region, and generally that's been an area that has full ice coverage year round. There's an archipelago, there's a lot of islands, it's sort of, the ice becomes locked in between these areas of land, and so it's quite stable and it's been quite consistent year round. So that's a pretty good area for bears. That's quite a successful area for them to flourish, because they have that ice for most of the year, if not all of the year. The next little area there is sort of the Beaufort Sea region and East Greenland, and that's what's known as the convergent region. The convergent region is where they have ice only along the shoreline in summer. So they have good coverage of ice in the winter, but in the summer, the ice generally dissipates, but there are areas close to shore where they still have ice. So they have some sort of refuge, as it were, where the bears can still get along and do okay. And then you have the large areas, the biggest ones, the divergent ones, which is the area that we will be in. Historically, they've had ice all year round, but now as the conditions change, that ice is no longer there year round, and it's becoming further and further away from the shoreline that you have to travel before you get to find ice. And so the bears are either being stranded way out north the ice is, or they get into that region. We saw in that little area, the Beaufort Sea animation there, where they give up on the ice and they go to land, and then they have to scratch around on the land looking for whatever they can find. They don't have any of that ice through those periods of summer. So that's that divergent region. And then finally is the seasonal region. And they're areas which are interesting because they're extremely rich in the springtime, but they've always had the ice completely melting away in summer. And so the bears there are well attuned to that cycle, and they really do well in that spring. They get lots and lots of food, they get lots and lots of seals, because they know that the ice is going to disappear. And so those population groups are prepared for it. But as the summer extends, again, they're being forced into that region where they have to survive for more days. So the different populations have different sort of pressures on them, some more than others, and some even have some advantages, although it might be transiently, and I'll go into that in a minute as well. So they're the population groups that we talk about, and that's why just looking at the ice coverage in the Arctic doesn't tell you the whole story. It affects them differently in different regions because it's behaving differently in those areas, and the bears are not used to it in various areas compared to others. So this is a chart, or a number of charts, showing the reduction in ice-covered days, what are called ice-covered days. So days that have more than 15% of the sea surface covered by ice, and how that's changed over the decades. And you can see this is just 9 of the 18 regions. And you can see in every case, the sea ice, or the number of days where they've had good ice cover in those areas, has reduced in every one of them. There's a downward slope in every one of them. And it can be from around about a half a day per year. So every year they're finding there's a half a day less ice than the previous year over that long term. But in particular, again, in the Barents Sea region, it's huge. It's by far the greatest extent of sea ice reduction anywhere in the Arctic. It's 4 days per year. So you can see there the 70s, they would have around about 300 days of good ice cover per year. Now it's down to around about 120, 150, somewhere in that region. So over those years, every year they've lost on average 4 days of good ice cover. So now, if you have only around about 120 days of good ice cover, and that continues in future years, you're getting down into those periods where there's almost no ice cover at all. And for the bears to find good amounts of food to keep them out of that danger sort of 180 days period where they're going to find it tough to survive, that's going to become very, very difficult. So the Barents Sea region in particular is one of the sort of canaries in the coal mine. They're losing it faster. They have all those other problems with those POPs, and they're going to be in a situation where they come under pressure much quicker, despite the fact that they have around about 10% of the population group. So as the sea ice reduces, what happens is the bears don't do as well. They have less feeding time, or good feeding time, and it's at both ends of the season as well. So the ice melts sooner and it forms later. So it's melting sooner. So that period of the spring when it's the time to make the best of the opportunities, that's not there as long. And then at the other end, particularly with the mothers, with the young cubs, they're around and they're waiting for the sea ice to reform. It's taking longer, and so the cubs have to survive in that marine environment longer before they get sort of their first winter on land. And so all of these things are creating pressure at both ends of the season. It's been found that 2 weeks of less ice can lead to an 8% weight reduction on average. And so those days and days, 4 days per year, that's what's that? That's only 3 or 4 years on average of 2 weeks of less ice, and so that's an 8% weight reduction, and the flow-on effects that has. As I said, they can still scratch out a living from land source diet, but it's much poorer. As I said, it's eggs and birds and maybe some carcasses. They might get a bit of fat, but they want fat. They want the seals, and the seals are on the ice. So they can get food, but it's not the sort of high energetic food that they really want to recover their condition or put them in a state where they can survive the conditions, the temperature conditions over a longer period. It also leads to less availability of denning and shorter suitability of those denning sites. So the temperature increases, the snow cover doesn't last as long, so those periods where the dens or the areas where the dens are available for those long periods is reduced, and in some cases they're no longer viable. So they become areas that they may have used traditionally, and they've had good denning areas where they just don't survive long enough for the mother to be able to shelter and suckle those young cubs, and to the point where they can get out and then head out into the environment. So it's affecting them when they're in their normal day-to-day life, but it's also affecting them in their reproduction in terms of their birth and their ability to raise the young to a point where they can survive on their own. And it's been found that in the 90s, bears were about 10% thinner and had 10% fewer cubs than in the 70s. And so that, I guess, was at a period when there was still long amounts of time with reasonable sea cover, and the sea ice cover now is even less, and so it's likely that reduction is exacerbated. So what's happening? So there's been a lot of studies done on the various future scenarios and looking at it, how it's likely to affect them and in which ways it's going to affect them as that ice reduces. So this is what's known as a high emission scenario. So you can see on the left there, it's got a large number of those regions in different parts of the world based on the, as I said, those 4 different styles of environment. And so you've got what's known as the RCP 8.5. So it's a bit technical, but it's a way of categorizing the amount of radiant heat or the radiation that's in the environment. So 8.5 watts per square meter is being subjected to that region, and so that is a high impact, or it's essentially extending the current production of greenhouse gas emissions with no abatement or no mitigation, nothing being done. So this is what was likely to happen if we continue as things have been done over the previous years. And what it shows is on the left is the recruitment of cubs, so the survivability of cubs, the impact on the adult females and the impact on the adult males over future decades through to the end of the century, and at what point the ice changes or diminishes that it starts to have an effect on them, from a possible effect on them to a likely to a very likely to an inevitable effect on them. And you can see there in the current scenario, in almost every one of those regions, of those 19 regions, before the end of the century, there's an inevitable impact on the survivability of the cubs. So basically the populations won't be replenishing themselves at all. Even now, in 2022, in the Hudson Bay area, it's starting to have a definite effect on the recruitment of cubs through the loss of sea ice. The survival of the females, or the males in particular, is much, much later, but even there, the effect on them by the end of the century essentially is inevitable in most regions. So if things continue as they are, the bears will not survive in any region. So all 19 regions this has been done for, and by the end of the century, there will be effects on both the adult and the replenishment of the population through the recruitment of cubs. There's no ifs or buts about it. That's going to happen. If you model it for a situation where there is abatement, there's mitigation, we change the amount of emissions into the environment. This is what's known as an RCP 4.5, so 4.5 watts per square metre into the environment. So that's a scenario where we would end up with a temperature rise of between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Even there, the cub recruitment in the coming decades through to the end of the century in pretty much all regions is very likely. It's not inevitable, but it is very likely. But significantly, the survival of the adult females and the adult males is changed substantially. They have a very likely chance that they won't be affected in the same way that they would be if things continued as per normal. Just going back to the previous one, you can see there it's likely that they'll be affected. It's almost inevitable, or it's inevitable in some places. If we do some abatement and mitigation, it changes substantially. So the bears aren't out of the woods at all, but if there is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and we can arrest the change of the sea ice periods where they're not available for the bears, they do at least have a fighting chance that they will survive long enough that they can adapt their behaviours, their hunting strategies, where they live, and their ultimate survival. So that's basically the issue, is there will be some effect, but if you change things too fast, animals can't adapt their behaviours. Not necessarily their adaptations or their evolution, but they can adapt their behaviours, their hunting strategies. And as I said, in some places, we're now seeing evidence of them hunting reindeer more often, where they would never do that before. So it gives them the time to learn these techniques or adapt these techniques to get them through these periods of relative absence of food and allow them to get through to some sort of a chance to stay within that region where they can survive. So an interesting demonstration there of how important it is. And so currently we have, this is the situation. These are the populations approximately in those regions. Interestingly, in that archipelago group, so over here in the sort of northern Canada area, with reducing sea ice, it's actually beneficial for them temporarily. So because you are reducing the amount of ice, that period where the ice allows them to hunt and get to seals through the ice or in cracks in the ice is actually extended because it's melting sooner. So the thick solid ice that they can't penetrate, the winter ice, is actually not present for as long. And so they're getting to the period where they have prime conditions for a longer period. But of course, if that continues, it goes past that point where they then run into periods where it goes beyond and they don't have ice at all, and that works against them. So at the moment, there are some regions where the reduction or the change in conditions of sea ice is beneficial, but it's very temporary and very transient. So if you see things where people say, oh, the bears have never done better and the numbers are increasing, that may be possible, but temporarily. It's kind of this transition phase where if it continues, it gets into the situation like the Barents Sea population where they're faced with the same issues that they are, even though the archipelago group currently doing reasonably well. And so this is the current situation. If we don't do anything, we have no other expectation that will be the future population of polar bears. So that's just hopefully a little bit of a background for you about how they live, why their lifestyle and the way they live and the way they survive is so unique to them, the changing conditions, and why it has the effects that it's having currently and it has had historically, and the way things will go in the future if we don't do anything. And so hopefully it sort of arms you a bit to maybe look at things in a different light or with a different perspective, not just now, but in the longer term as well. So hopefully, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that's been a benefit for you. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to do my best to try and answer them for you.
Anyone, any questions?
Yeah, Graeme, I actually have a question. Polar bears, are they considered nocturnal, or what's their general time that they're more active? I know during the summer times they're usually conserving energy, but are they more nocturnal, or what is that?
No, so they're not nocturnal at all because they have such skewed, well, they don't have a normal day sort of cycle. They go from 24 hours of daylight to 24 hours of darkness. They have to survive no matter what the conditions. And so they will do whatever they want whenever they want. They, as I said, some of those late winter, early spring periods are the prime hunting time, and it's certainly in the most northerly reaches, it's nowhere near long periods of daylight, but they will hunt day and night effectively. They will do whatever they can. They have to take advantage when they can. And then again in summer, they will sleep, they will hunt, they will forage, they'll do whatever at any time of the day or night. So they essentially work on their own time frame, independent of diurnal cycles of daylight or darkness.
Thank you.
No problems.
Any question, anybody? Hey, Graeme, just curious. Around early December, were you aware that there was hardly any ice in the field? So I got a call from a friend that lived in Longyearbyen, and she actually worked with the Polar Institute and say that the bear is struggling to find a place to den. Did you hear anything about that?
Yeah, exactly. They've had quite a low ice year in Svalbard this year. As we're heading up there, we're looking now. We're early season. This is the first trip for Aurora heading to Svalbard. We're looking at the ice charts. They're already ships at 81.5 degrees north. We would, in previous seasons, we wouldn't even attempt to go that far north up to the northern parts through the Seven Islands until mid to late July. So this year is quite a low ice year, not only in the sea but around, but also in the fjords. And so, yes, that's true. They have this problem of the sea ice in the fjords creates a platform, and that affects the snow accumulation. So if you don't have as much snow in the fjords, or if you don't have it for as long, you don't get these big ramps and you don't get these build-up of deep snow areas, and so they can't build their dens, which is one of the problems I was saying. And so I'm not sure about particularly this year, but certainly in years of low ice conditions, it can definitely affect their denning regions. So, yeah, this year I think in particular, I'm not sure where it sits in the overall scheme of things, but from all the evidence that we've seen and heard, it has been quite a low ice year during the winter in Svalbard.
Yeah, that is a huge concern because you lose the entire juvenile population this year. For example, I think this year all the harp seals in the bay up in Canada, it lost the entire population of harp seal this year.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's another thing I didn't go into. Not only do you not have the dens for the ring seals, but you don't have thick enough ice that can support the pups of the other seals, and they're born and they end up in the water too soon, basically, and they don't survive. It's like emperor penguins in the Antarctic. If the ice disappears before they're ready, you have high mortality events. And so periods of this, you end up not having the food supplies for the bears, and so that affects them multiple ways, not only through their own denning, but the denning of the seals and the birth of the seals on the ice surface. So it all adds up to bad news.
Yeah, so it's all what I call disruption to the entire food chain.
Yeah.
Sure. Anybody? Any more questions? Thank you so much, Graeme. That's very, very informative. Very educational. We learned a lot.
If I may, one question. It's
Sure.
Bridget here. Hello.
Hi.
I would love to know, because I'm planning to go diving, what are the chances that polar bears might be swimming around where, of course, we won't be diving where they are, but still, what to expect?
Yeah, we do see bears swimming. We have strict rules. We are not allowed to approach bears swimming at all. So if we do see bears in the water, we actually go away. But we sometimes can be sailing 20 miles offshore heading towards the north, and there's a bear just swimming across in front of us. So we do occasionally see bears. We've been getting our firearms program and polar bear safety programs underway today, and one of the things we talk about is to make sure that we patrol and look to the water, because the biggest surprise you can get is from a bear coming out of the water, and it does happen. And they are a very small target. They're not target in terms of to hit, but it's a very small area of visibility that you see, and they're very stealthy, and so you can see them. We do see them swimming occasionally, and sometimes mums and cubs will be swimming. But yeah, it's quite random. We never really know. But yes, there is a possibility.
Get a camera ready, Bridget. I'll be the first one to be there. All right, anybody, any questions? If not, thank you so much, Snowy. We'll see you on the 25th, maybe, or the evening if you're up in the bar.
Yep, no problems.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good luck. Good luck with all your flights up to Oslo, and look forward to seeing you in Svalbard in a couple of weeks, and look forward to the trip again.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye, everyone. Good night, everybody.